To ask Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones to come to the podium and to ask Mr. David Cox and Kirk Anthony Hamilton to come forward and discuss the digital transformation to enable innovation and entrepreneurship. Therese, over to you.
Wow, I'm glad I wasn't on that panel. We're going to bring this to reality and what I think is also the potential of what digitalization can really do for this region. First of all, I want to congratulate CDB for taking on this topic, because for those of you who've been working with me at the IDB for the last 3 years, we've been on this journey for a long time. I'm really also impressed to be sitting up here behind a sign that says transformation, and it's not related to anything spiritual. So I think this is the biggest mindset change at the CDB I've seen since I've been coming to CDB meetings. So a round of applause for CDB. So going back to that amazing animated video we saw at the beginning, I want to go back to Camille, because Camille had a vision for her granddaughter. But actually, I see myself as Camille, and I'm not going to wait for my granddaughter to get to where the granddaughter in the video wants to be, because I think we're actually closer to getting to the reality that we need in this region, because it's been quite a bit of progress. So just a couple of data points, and I know all of you know this, but it's a good thing to remind you. So there are 9 billion mobile devices. Probably more 9 billion, close to 10 billion now, but 9 billion of these around the world. There are about 1.5 million robots already in existence. There are something like, just to give you the right number, there are, 23 billion connected devices already. And this is the Internet of Things, this is 5G. So all of our providers, and I'm going to single out Flow and Cable and Wireless, even though we're not, David is here to talk in his Cantu head, but we want to talk about what's going on in the world, the exponential growth in technology we're seeing. Every 2 years, the chip doubles its capacity. The world that Avi was describing with regulation can't keep pace with what's happening actually in the world, because all of us really want to live our lives with our mobile device. But in the Caribbean, this is really difficult to do. So I'm going to open up with a general question for these two guys to say, where are we really in getting Camille, not her granddaughter, getting to Camille to the reality of being able to do those things? Avi also described it. To have all of our government services connected, to have this region functioning in a digital way and not an analog way, because basically we're living in an analog world in the Caribbean. I just came back from St. Thomas, and the transportation system there drove me nuts. There's a guy with a walkie-talkie in the vehicle and a cell phone, and he's controlling the base, and he's got 5 people in the vehicle, and he's trying to run the transportation system that way. So, Kirk, Tech Beach and what you're trying to do, what do you see, and how far are we from realizing this dream?
Interesting start. Thank you very much. So I would say it's kind of twofold. On one end, we're extremely far along in the sense that a lot of the solutions that we're looking for actually exist. On the other end, we are very far behind in the sense that we as a region have so far failed to truly adapt into the new global dynamic that exists. And so if I even look at the the last panel discussion, you can kind of see that tension that is arising, in the sense that we have 2 whole different playing fields at odds with each other. And the challenge in the region, I would argue so far, is that these 2 worlds are not managing to meet in a way that truly drives progress and collaboration. From my end, what I would encourage and simply state today is that, we live in a space where there are certain inevitabilities, and we have to decide where as a region we want to go. But the fact is that we're not going to stop the movement of technology and innovation, and therefore there has to be some coming together in order for us to advance. And that is where we're stalling, is that these two bodies are not able to meet in a way that causes meaningful and positive outcomes.
David, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. First, let me just say what an incredible honor it is to be here and to have been invited by the CDB in my capacity as chairman of Canto. So thanks to whoever had that particular stroke of genius. Just kidding. I think that the Caribbean, if I had to grade the Caribbean, I would say that it's a mixed bag. I'd give it a solid sort of C+. I think in the region we have a tendency to overstate how far back we are because we are often playing catch up as a developing part of the world in so many ways. And the progress toward real digital transformation can often seem overwhelming. But I think just for the purposes of the discussion, it's important to, or helpful rather, for me to try to break down our journey in two spheres. Often when we talk about digitization and transformation and digital economies, the reality is that the presumption in most people's minds is focused on governments. And they are focused on the work or the lack of progress that governments in the region are making in making sure that it will be possible for you, for example, to get on your phone and say that you need, open an app, say that you need to get your passport replaced, send in the information digitally, and then go to the passport office and pick it up the next day or have it delivered to your house. People are frustrated about the fact that the governments in the region appear to be so far behind. We want to see the progress that we know that the technology can provide in helping make our societies more efficient. The challenge that, and if you think about it, that entire video that we saw with Camille, almost all of it was really focused on the things that governments need to do to enable that transformation. If we look at that sphere, the reality is that the report card is poor. And we can talk about some of the reasons for that, and I have some particular theories about that, but that's the reality. And this isn't an indictment by me on our regional governments. I think that the problem is complex and the factors which are leading to this state of affairs are multiple. So it's not intended as a criticism, merely as an observation of fact. On the other hand, the reality is that digital transformation is fundamentally driven by entrepreneurs, by the private sector. That the true transformation that's going on in the region is being led by people like Kirk, who is using technology to advance the mission of the region in a new and novel way and is adding value. But we should also not forget that the entrepreneur is not just amazing people like Kirk. Entrepreneurs also, in our Caribbean context, the hairdresser, the barber. One day, I'll tell a quick story. I was here about 10 years ago, and I stopped by the side of the road. I don't know where it was, and I had the most amazing doubles with this fantastic tamarind chutney, and it changed my life. I've never been able to get it since, despite many visits to Trinidad. But one day, somebody, some entrepreneur in Trinidad and Tobago who makes fantastic doubles is going to decide that they'll create an app and they'll sell their doubles and have them delivered to business places and to offices and to whoever orders them. And they'll expand their business and become rich in what seems overnight, even though it might have taken them several years. That kind of innovation is going on in the Caribbean every single day. I worked with someone who left their job, retired early, so that they could start a startup company directed to small businesses to provide financial accounting services to small businesses. So the innovation that is happening other places in the world is going on in the private sector in the region. And it's important for us not to lose sight of that. I want to close this by, this opening comment with one more observation, which is that we need to remember also that everything we're talking about, whether on the government side, public sector side, or on the private sector side, is dependent on connectivity. It is dependent on private investments by companies like Cable and Wireless or Digicel or any operator who is spending money to extend networks into our societies. We need that connectivity to get people in rural communities connected, etc. And those things can be helped or hindered by good government policy and poor government policy. And that's why the dialogue is important.
Yeah. So let me just add another fact here. So the UN e-Government Development Index of 2018 ranks 3 Caribbean countries out of, well, the 6 for which I have data. 3 are above the world average: Barbados, Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago. 3 are well below: Suriname, Jamaica, and Guyana on e-government readiness. The Global ICT Development Index of 2017, same 3 countries rank above the average, and the same 3 countries well below. So this gives you an idea of that there is progress, there is potential, but we have a lot of work to do. So how do we move beyond knowing that at least half of the countries in this region, these are big countries, big leaders in the region, who are almost ready to embrace technology to improve the digital platforms of government. Apart from the infrastructure, we hear a lot about there's not enough connectivity, there's not enough bandwidth, there's not enough coverage, there's not enough penetration. From your, where you sit, what are the companies in the ICT world who are the providers of all the connectivity we need in this region? What needs to be done next to move us to this other level?
Well, first of all, let me just add a perspective. We focus a lot when we talk about digitization on, frankly, fixed wireline broadband in the homes, but the mobile penetration rates for the Caribbean are through the roof, largely over 100% in a number of these islands. And the fact is that people are now able to access a greater level of speed from their phones than they do or can at their homes. That is a significant transformative tool, which I think we don't think about enough. I think the issue on the private sector side is that we need to we need to encourage the companies on whose, the networks on who we depend to continue to invest in those networks. And it's incredibly difficult in this age of disruption. The competition has changed. Technology is disrupting the industry. And therefore, I think the key question is, what are the right types of policies that governments need to think about in order to continue to encourage that investment? And very briefly, we need to think about, I think we need to think about the pace of regulation, the type of regulation. Governments need to recognize that at the moment, the industry is so disruptive that a too invasive approach to regulation is detrimental. We need to collaborate for rural communities and think about reducing the bureaucracy, in particular in regional telecoms regulators in particular, around things like spectrum. The reason that spectrum is important is because companies like TSTT and others can provide meaningful solutions to connect people in rural communities in Trinidad and Tobago using spectrum that is resilient, that provides high levels of speeds at a more efficient, at certainly more efficient sort of levels than they would if they had to extend physical wires, et cetera, into those communities. And we need to get to those poor and rural communities.
There's a really hot question here on Slido. Will telecoms change their current business model of charging per megabyte, per MB, I guess, to unlimited data to unleash access to information and promote more digital services? Do you have a response to that?
They're already doing that. I mean, if you look at the cost of data across the region, the cost of data has been going down, exponentially. And in Jamaica, for example, Cable and Wireless just recently released a number of new products in which customers have unlimited, they can speak to each other and without cost, and they pay for data, but the data packages are huge. Now, those types of products are going to have a huge transformational effect on societies in Jamaica, on societies like Jamaica.
For me, that's a leading indicator that Caribbean citizens want to do more business on their mobile devices.
Absolutely.
Right? I want to be, just like in Estonia, I want to be able to vote from my phone, open up a business on my phone in 18 minutes, including a bank account. I want to be able to make a doctor's appointment, check into my son or daughter's class to see what's going on in real time, right? All of this technology is available, but somehow we're not there yet. So, Kirk, tell us how Camille, is that going to happen or not?
Well, first I'd like to jump in on the part that I think, firstly, too often in the region, we are way too satisfied with the idea of where we are as opposed to where we can be. And so you hear these, anecdotes that suggest that, there's a lot of activity, for example, happening, and, there are offerings in places like Jamaica that are, on some end, supposedly, world class and such. And I'm Jamaican. I love Jamaica. I'm the biggest champion of the island. However, I speak to something different, right? So in 2013, I co-founded an investment firm in the US. We raised some capital from high net worth individuals in the Caribbean, and we went about looking to buy into mobile app development companies in the United States. And when I decided to depart that business, one of the things that I walked away with was I said to people, one, it was getting the story out there was a bit difficult. Two, when we bought into these app development businesses, one of the things we said as a growth strategy was we can come into the Caribbean and sell this service to large corporates. That's what we said to the app development firms, as any private equity kind of deal maker would. And we hit brick walls in the region when we tried to get them on board with this concept. And so when I stepped away, which was about 5 years ago, I started to say, 5 years from now, a few things are going to happen. The words in innovation and disruption are going to become pitch words in the Caribbean, which were already pitch words in advanced markets. I won't say everywhere else in the world. And I also said that every large corporate is going to end up then wanting to have apps. And so said, so done. But one of the realities back then, which is starting to unfold now, is that technology doesn't wait. And so now we're living in a realm where those same mobile devices that you're talking about are changing and transforming. And so now when we want apps, the providers are moving to a different system, right? The developers of technology are moving to something else, and we are not on the same playing field, right? So the major challenge that I see, whether you talk about government, private sector, etc., is simply the fact that in the modern landscape, which I consider to be multidisciplinary, multidimensional, we often fail to recognize where these overlaps come together, which ultimately is a space where new enterprise is created. And so, the guy making doubles who could ultimately transform, what is a fairly, is an extremely analog business into something that is able to grow through some kind of digital connectivity, so far has been unable to meet at a point where all the different pieces required for that enterprise to be created are able to come together in somewhat seamless fashion. And the reality is that entrepreneurship is hard anywhere in the world, right? It is tough to take something from, it's tough to take nothing and turn it into something. However, when you have a real ecosystem that is designed to support business and designed, more importantly, to support something that is very important here in the concept of new enterprise, right? Something coming from nowhere. we simply don't have that fabric. We don't have a fabric that allows a certain level of individuality to reach its maximum potential and see the light of day and turn into something that creates not just wealth, but opportunity for many others. Yeah. So that's where we want to go. And
this point is heavily linked to this hot question about how do we move beyond just the basic digitalization to massive transformation, right? I know Avi and I spent a lot of time talking about it's not just about digitalization, it's about all the other things. But in my mind, they're all connected, whether it's the 5-year-old after early childhood education being educated in a different way. There's a whole supply chain that needs to be adjusted in the mentality of every Caribbean person, and that has to start very early. And we're not there yet. And the other point, the other question here is yes or no, do the policymakers get it? And I don't think it's just a question of generational. I know we've talked a lot about that. Is it a generational thing, or our new leaders will definitely be different because they're younger and they've grown up on the smartphone. But do they really get this bigger picture out there that we have to transform every aspect of how the region works? And we haven't even talked about these other threats that are on us of climate change and the need to build resiliency. And you can do that if we're operating differently. Comments?
So my thing would be, firstly, we need to start using terms like rethink and reinvent. There is a need for what I would consider, without placing any insult on the systems that already exist, to really start thinking about a level of overhaul if we're going to achieve the things that we are discussing, getting towards. The panel that was up here earlier, I think, touched on this point in many areas. If transformation is a real word, right? And it has a lot of it comes with a lot, right? And there is a whole mindset shift that needs to occur. That's the kind of work that we are pursuing with our platforms. But ultimately, when you talk about, developing an ecosystem, you talk about developing a pipeline, there are all these different layers. And it needs to start, as you mentioned, from early childhood education. But at the same time, we can't forget about those who are at what may be perceived at an end. And we can't forget about people like myself who are kind of in the middle, where we started using computers relatively early, but we weren't born with them in our hands and such like that. Because, in order for us I wasn't taught to build what we have managed to build. And I've always said to people, it's one of the most interesting things. I have a friend who's a doctor from the Caribbean, went through the entire process as we all know it, moved to Toronto, called me one day as an entrepreneur and said, Kirk, one of the things that I'm realizing, and it's not just a Caribbean thing, but when you think about entrepreneurship, when you think about technology, you think about innovation, why is it that we weren't taught, when you walk onto an elevator, to have the thought, what? Could this be done better? And that ultimately really is what entrepreneurship is. That ultimately is what innovation is. And you have to nurture that. And I would, again, kind of emphasize on the point that in the traditional system that I grew up in the Caribbean, I was never taught to think in that way. Where I got a lot of that thinking from was when I went to art and design school to study architecture, and I was with a bunch of, what would be considered misfits in this part of the world. Mm-hmm. And I observed them thinking in these, extreme outward manners that I used to think was crazy, until I started accepting and realizing that, all they are doing is perceiving a world that they want, as opposed to the world that they're living in. Whereas what I was doing was I was developing and showcasing things that I knew could be done, but not what, I wasn't thinking broad enough and imagining far enough. So that was a huge impact on me, and I would argue that that is a very necessary asset in order to create a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem.
So we have just under 2 minutes. David, yeah. So do the policymakers get it? And what do they really need to get?
No,
what do we want them to get?
No, they don't, and that's because...
We have a lot of them in this room.
I'm sorry. I never said it. No, unfortunately not. And I think that's I've mentioned this. My view is that that's because there's a generational shift that needs to happen at the policy level. A lot of our Caribbean leaders are born at a time when the world was still very analog, and so the imagination necessary to understand in a real way, they understand it intellectually. Caribbean people are extremely bright, so they understand it intellectually, but emotionally they don't yet understand or perceive how the technology should be used, and why it's so absolutely necessary to do it with urgency. If I could just synthesize a couple of points, and because Kirk makes I think a very fundamental point about there is a cultural problem. There are two major challenges I see in the Caribbean. There are others, but in the time that I have left, there are two major challenges I see. One is cultural, as he points out. We have a colonial inheritance of an educational system which encourages, for lack of just for speed of thought, servitude. So it encourages, it's a very grammar school type oriented education system, which encourages people to sort of go through a traditional, process of learning, and then which requires them often to be employees. We don't have an education system which encourages a lot of risk taking. That needs to change, but that's a broader cultural thing. The more fundamental thing that needs to happen at a policy level is that governments need to invest far more heavily, far more directly, with far more urgency in coding in an education system which promotes risk-taking, but which also exposes people to the basic building blocks of creating software and creating code. And if we can do that, I think we will see some of the transformation. The other, and I'll end on this point, the other fairly significant challenge we have is venture capital, is money. Kirk's success is directly related to the fact that he could get access to funding at some point that believed in the ideas that he had and could empower it. In the example I use of this person making the doubles, that person would need to be able to get somebody who could build an app if they couldn't. In order to build an app, you need to have the skills. Once you build it, in order to be able to get that person, you need to be able to pay them. And then as that company grows, you need investors to help it. Those are the missing links: the skills, the money. Having said that, we are still doing great things in the region. We are not where we need to be, but we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves.
Yeah, no, I see. There's a lot of energy around this topic now. I'm so glad to see CDB is on board. The light is flashing red, but this last point of should internet access be a human right, I would say yes. I think we're headed that way. I think the UN's going to eventually get there. And to take another leaf out of the Estonians' book, they used to have 3 virtues as emblematic of what Estonia is. And the first one was mother, for obvious reasons. The second one was bread. Everyone has to eat. The third one is forest, take care of nature. And now the fourth one is internet, and Wi-Fi. So that's where I want to end this. We need a similar set of real clear objectives and goals in this region. I think we can get there. All the partners in this room know how to do this. There was a question about how can development, multilaterals, and others help? How can our partners help? It's what you want to do. We finance in the IDB challenges that you have and where you put the priorities, and the same for the CDB. So we look forward to working on these issues in the future.
Well, I know we're wrapping. I just wanted to share then that, based on David's final comments and even yours, ultimately what we've been working to create with Tech Beach and our other platforms is that new ecosystem that is necessary for the kinds of businesses that people want to design now to thrive. And again, I kind of reflect on the last panel just to say, when we talk about where the policymakers are and where we need to go, the reality that I tend to try to share with people is that tomorrow looks nothing like today. The kinds of businesses that people want to build look nothing like the ones that we have now. And the people who are going to end up building these businesses do not look like the people who have built the ones that we currently engage with. And so the most important thing I think that we need to get to in terms of our policymakers and institutions and such like that, again, is really reaching to a point where people come together towards an understanding, because currently there's a huge disconnect. And the disconnect simply is that people do not comprehend each other in this space currently, especially in this region. And when we get to the point where you can understand that, to that same thing that I said earlier, the businesses will not look the same as what we're seeing out there. When we get to a greater point of understanding is when I think you will start to see the kind of shifts necessary for success in this part of the world to happen in this category of new business.
Yeah. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.